Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for more stories. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Brandon Keene stood in his study, surrounded by commendations, medals, and photographs from 21 years of distinguished military service. The silver star gleamed under the amber light, a testament to his valor during the Battle of Helmand. But tonight, these symbols of honor felt hollow, mocking even. The 41-year-old former Special Forces colonel had retired 8 months ago to a hero's welcome in Silver Creek, Colorado. His transition to civilian life should have been smooth. A beautiful wife, a successful security consulting business, and a daughter about to graduate high school. Yet, something had been gnawing at him for days. Melissa Keene, his wife of 16 years, had grown distant. The woman who once waited eagerly for his returns from deployment now barely looked up from her phone when he entered a room. Her explanations were always plausible. Book club meetings, volunteer work at the clinic, girls' nights out. But Brandon's instincts, honed by years of reading enemy movements and detecting threats, screamed that something was wrong. "Dad, you're brooding again," came a voice from the doorway. Hannah Keene, 16 and sharp as a blade, leaned against the frame. She had inherited her father's steel-gray eyes and observational skills. Just thinking about the Whitmore account, Brandon lied smoothly. Whitmore Global was his biggest client, requiring protection for their CEO during a series of high-profile negotiations. Hannah stepped closer, her expression serious. "It's Mom, isn't it?" Brandon studied his daughter's face. Hannah had always been perceptive, but the sadness in her eyes suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "What makes you say that?" "She's been different, secretive, and there's this cop who's been coming around when you're not here. Brian something says it's about neighborhood watch stuff." But Hannah trailed off. "Brian." Brandon filed the name away. "What does he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, thinks he's hot stuff. Drives a black Dodge Charger. Mom gets all giggly around him." The pieces clicked into place with military precision. Brandon had suspected infidelity, but hearing it confirmed by his own daughter sent a cold rage through his veins. Had seen betrayal in war zones, but this cut deeper than any enemy blade. "Hannah," he said carefully, "I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens in the coming days, remember that I love you more than anything in this world." Before she could respond, Melissa's voice echoed from downstairs. "Brandon." The Keene family gathered around the dinner table like they had hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. Melissa chattered about her day, her voice too bright, her smile too wide. She mentioned going to Denver the next day for a medical conference. "Which hospital is hosting it?" Brandon asked casually. "Swedish Medical Center." Melissa replied without missing a beat. "Dr. Nguyen is presenting on new cardiac procedures." Brandon nodded, already planning to verify her story. In his experience, liars often prepared surface details but neglected deeper verification. After dinner, as Melissa showered, Brandon made a call to his old friend Aaron Phelps, now working private security in Denver. "Bran, how's retirement treating you?" "Could be better. I need a favor, Aaron." Quietly. "There's a medical conference at Swedish tomorrow. I need to know if Dr. Nguyen is presenting. Give me 10 minutes. Aaron called back with the answer Brandon expected. No conference. No Dr. Nguyen presenting anything. That night, Brandon lay in bed next to his wife, listening to her breathing, planning his next move. Had spent years tracking insurgents and terrorists. Now, he would use those same skills on his own wife. Brandon's surveillance began at dawn. Using techniques learned from a career in special operations, he positioned himself strategically to observe Melissa's movements without being detected. His target, the woman he loved for nearly 2 decades, had no idea she was being watched by one of the military's most decorated operatives. Melissa left the house at 9:30 a.m., dressed professionally as if heading to a medical conference. Instead of taking the highway to Denver, she drove to the Canyon View Motel, a rundown establishment on the outskirts of Silver Creek. Brandon watched from a distance as a black Dodge Charger pulled up 20 minutes later. Brian Caldwell emerged from the vehicle, and Brandon got his first good look at his wife's lover. Early 30s, muscular build, and wearing a Silver Creek Police Department uniform. The cocky swagger in his walk suggested a man accustomed to intimidating others through his position and badge. Brandon's jaw clenched as he watched Brian knock on room 214. Melissa opened the door wearing a satin lounge robe, pulled the officer inside, and closed the door. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, but Brandon forced himself to remain calm and observant. For the next 3 hours, Brandon documented everything: license plates, times, even the room number. His military training kicked in. Gather intelligence, analyze patterns, identify weaknesses. At 1:45 p.m., Brian emerged first, straightening his uniform and checking his appearance in the car's side mirror. He drove away with the same arrogance had arrived with. Melissa left 25 minutes later, stopping at a coffee shop to establish her alibi before returning home. That evening, Melissa regaled Brandon with fictional details about the conference, describing presentations that never happened and colleagues she'd never met. Each lie felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice honey with deception. "Productive," Brandon replied. "Made some interesting discoveries." Over the following 10 days, Brandon expanded his surveillance. He discovered that Brian Caldwell was a 13-year veteran of the Silver Creek Police Department, recently divorced and known for his aggressive tactics. More importantly, Brandon learned that Brian had been boasting to fellow officers about having a sweet setup and playing the long game. The breakthrough came when Brandon followed Brian to O'Malley's Tavern, a cop hangout downtown, using a directional microphone part of his security consulting equipment. Brandon recorded Brian's conversation with Detective Ryan Connolly. "The old soldier boy doesn't suspect a thing," Brian laughed, downing his beer. "Melissa's got him wrapped around her finger. Soon as the divorce is final, he'll have everything I need to take him down a peg." "What do you mean?" Ryan asked. "Man spent 20 years doing ugly work for Uncle Sam. You think he came home clean? I've been building a file, planting evidence. When the time comes, he'll raid his house, find what I need to find, and send the war hero to prison. Melissa gets everything in the divorce, and we split it down the middle." Brandon's blood ran cold. This wasn't just adultery. It was an elaborate conspiracy to destroy his life and steal everything Head worked for. Brian planned to frame him for crimes Head never committed. The conversation continued, revealing more details of their scheme. Brian had been using his position to plant evidence in Brandon's security consulting files, suggesting illegal weapons dealing. Melissa had been photographing documents and feeding information to Brian for months. That night, Brandon sat in his study, staring at his medals and commendations. The silver star, bronze star, purple heart symbols of a life spent serving his country with honor. Now they were about to be weaponized against him by a corrupt cop and his faithless wife. But Brandon Keene wasn't just any soldier. He was special operations trained in psychological warfare, counterintelligence, and tactical planning. Brian and Melissa had made a fatal error. They targeted a man who knew how to fight dirty and win. Brandon opened his laptop and began making calls to old military contacts. It was time to remind Silver Creek why Special Forces operators were called quiet professionals. The emphasis was on quiet. Brandon spent the next 3 weeks building his counter-operation with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in military circles. His first call went to Marcus Redding, his former sergeant major who now ran a private military contracting firm. "Colonel, good to hear from you. How can I help?" "I need intelligence on a local police officer named Brian Caldwell. Full background, financial records, any dirt you can dig up. And Marcus, this one's personal." "Say no more, sir. Give me 60 hours. Brandon's network extended far beyond traditional military channels. Caleb Monroe, a former intelligence operative turned cybersecurity expert, owed Brandon his life from a mission in Syria. Within hours, Caleb had infiltrated Brian's digital footprint, revealing a pattern of corruption that went far deeper than adultery. The intelligence painted a disturbing picture. Brian Caldwell had been skimming money from contraband seizures for years, splitting profits with several fellow officers. Had also been selling confiscated weapons on the black market and had ties to an organized crew operating in Colorado. More importantly, Brandon discovered that Brian had used similar tactics before. Brian's ex-wife had accused him of planting evidence during their divorce proceedings, though the charges were dropped after she mysteriously withdrew her complaint and left town. "Classic pattern," Brandon muttered, studying the files. Brian identifies wealthy targets, charms their wives, builds false cases, then takes everything in the aftermath. But Brian had made a critical miscalculation. Brandon wasn't some businessman or civilian. He was a man who had spent 2 decades studying enemy tactics and developing countermeasures. Brandon's daughter, Hannah, had been watching her father's transformation with growing concern. The easygoing retired soldier was being replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. "Dad, you're scaring me," she said one evening, finding him cleaning his service pistol in the study. "I need you to trust me, Hannah. Your mother and Brian are planning something that could destroy our family. I won't let that happen." "What kind of something?" Brandon considered how much to tell his daughter. In the end, he decided on the truth. "They're planning to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Brian wants to send me to prison and take everything we have." Hannah's face went pale. "Mom would never. Your mother has been feeding Brian information for months. They're involved, Hannah, and they're criminals." The revelation hit Hannah like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to remind them who they're dealing with." Brandon's plan began to take shape. Rather than simply expose Brian's corruption, he would use it against him. The corrupt cop had built his scheme on lies and planted evidence weapons that could be turned in any direction. The first phase involved Javier Ortiz, a former Delta Force operative who now worked in equipment procurement. Javier could provide untraceable gear and specialized equipment that wasn't available through normal channels. "What kind of operation are we talking about, Colonel?" Javier asked during their encrypted video call. "The kind where everyone goes home alive. But some people learn hard lessons about consequences." "Copy that. Sending you a care package." Brandon also reached out to Noah Brandt, a former Navy SEAL who'd become a master forger. Noah could create documents that would redirect Brian's own schemes back at him. As the pieces fell into place, Brandon felt the familiar calm that came before battle. His targets had no idea they were about to face a man who turned warfare into an art form. The confrontation Brian planned would indeed happen, but it wouldn't go the way he expected. 4 nights before Brian's planned raid, Brandon made one final call to Terrence Walsh, his former commanding officer and current Pentagon liaison. "Bran, I was wondering when you'd reach out. Heard some interesting chatter about Silver Creek, Colorado." "What kind of chatter?" "The kind that suggests someone's been asking questions about your service record. Official channels. Someone with a badge." Brandon smiled coldly. "Perfect. When they come asking, make sure they get the full file, the classified portions, too. Especially those." Terrence chuckled. "This is going to be interesting. Should I expect collateral damage?" "Only to people who deserve it." As Brandon hung up, he felt the last piece of his plan click into place. Brian Caldwell thought he was hunting a sheep. Instead, had stumbled into the den of a wolf. Brandon's counter-operation moved into high gear as Brian's planned raid approached. Intelligence gathered by his network revealed that Brian had scheduled the operation for Friday morning when Hannah would be at school and Melissa would be visiting her sister in Denver. Another fabricated alibi. The corrupt officer had convinced his superior, Chief Luis Ramirez, that Brandon posed a clear and present danger to the community. Brian's fabricated evidence suggested the former Special Forces officer was dealing in illegal weapons and potentially planning domestic terrorism. But Brandon had spent the week preparing a welcome that would exceed Brian's wildest expectations. Working with Javier Ortiz, Brandon had acquired specialized surveillance equipment that would record everything. Hidden cameras with military-grade encryption were positioned throughout the house, creating a complete record of the raid. More importantly, Caleb Monroe had hacked into Brian's phone, giving Brandon real-time access to his communications. "They're moving up the timeline," Caleb reported via encrypted message. "Brian just told Melissa to be gone by 8:15 a.m. tomorrow. He's bringing 5 officers and a SWAT team." Brandon smiled grimly. Brian was bringing overwhelming force to intimidate a man he believed was unprepared. The corrupt cop had no idea he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. That evening, Brandon sat down with Hannah for what might be their last conversation before everything changed. "Tomorrow morning, I need you to go to school early before 7:15 a.m. Can you do that?" "Dad, what's going to happen?" "Justice," Brandon replied simply. "But I need you safe while it happens." "What about Mom?" Brandon's expression hardened. "Your mother made her choice months ago. She chose them over us." Hannah nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand." At 6:15 a.m. Friday morning, Brandon watched from his study window as Melissa loaded a suitcase into her car. She was running true to form, abandoning ship before the storm hit. As she drove away, Brandon felt the last emotional connection to his wife of 16 years finally sever. At 7:20 a.m., Brandon received a text from Brian. "Time's up, soldier boy. Hope you're ready for what's coming." Brandon's response was simple. "More ready than you know." The assault began at 8 a.m. with overwhelming force designed to shock and intimidate. Brian led 5 officers and a 3-man SWAT element through Brandon's front door with a battering ram, shouting commands, and waving weapons. "Brandon Keene, get on the ground. Now." Brandon sat calmly in his study, wearing his dress uniform with every medal and commendation perfectly positioned. The sight stopped Brian cold as he burst through the door. Well, Brandon said quietly. "Officer Brian Caldwell. Right on time." "Get on the __ ground," Brian screamed. But something in Brandon's demeanor made him hesitate. "I don't think so," Brandon replied. "You see, Brian, I've been expecting you, and I've prepared a few surprises." That's when Brian noticed the camera's professional-grade equipment positioned to capture every angle, every word, every action. His face went pale as he realized he was being recorded. "What the hell is this?" "This," Brandon said, rising slowly from his chair, "is the end of your little scheme. Did you really think you could frame a Special Forces colonel without consequences?" Brian's confidence cracked, but he pressed forward. "We have a warrant. You're under arrest for weapons trafficking and for weapons that you planted," Brandon interrupted. "Weapons that my friend Javier traced back to your own black market operations. Should we discuss your organized connections while we're at it?" The room fell silent, except for the hum of recording equipment. Brian's fellow officers exchanged confused glances, suddenly uncertain about the operation they'd been told was routine. "You're bluffing," Brian said, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Brandon smiled coldly. "Am I? Perhaps we should call your friend Ryan Connolly. Ask him about your conversation at O'Malley's last week. The one where you confessed to planting evidence and planning to steal my assets." Brian's face went white. "You son of __. Language, Officer Caldwell. We're being recorded for posterity." The standoff in Brandon's study stretched taut as Brian realized his carefully laid trap had become his own prison. The other officers, sensing something was wrong, began looking to their leader for guidance that never came. "Hey Race, what's going to happen?" Brandon continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "You're going to call your supervisor and explain that this raid was based on fabricated evidence. Then you're going to arrest yourself." "Like hell I am," Brian snarled, raising his weapon. That was the moment Brandon had been waiting for. With movements too fast for the eye to follow, he closed the distance between them, disarmed Brian, and had the corrupt officer on the ground in a submission hold that cut-off blood flow to his brain. "Gentlemen," Brandon addressed the stunned officers, his voice calm despite having just neutralized their leader. "I suggest you lower your weapons and listen carefully. Your partner has been lying to you." Detective Ryan Connolly stepped forward, his weapon trained on Brandon. "Let him go. Let him go, Ryan," Brandon said quietly. "How long have you known Brian was skimming seizure money?" The question hit Ryan like a physical blow. His weapon wavered. "That's right, Detective. I know about the missing evidence, the unreported seizures, the money that's been disappearing from your department for years. Brian has been stealing, and he's been cutting other people in." Brandon released Brian, who gasped for air on the floor. "The difference is I can prove it." Caleb Monroe's voice came through hidden speakers, clear and professional. "Detective Connolly, this is Caleb Monroe, former intelligence analyst. I've been monitoring your department's financial records for the past 17 days. Would you like me to read the amounts that have been transferred from evidence accounts to offshore accounts?" The effect was devastating. Ryan's weapon dropped to his side as the weight of exposure settled over him. The other officers looked between their partners and Brandon, trying to understand what was happening. "You want to know what your problem is, Brian?" Brandon asked, pulling the corrupt officer to his feet. "You thought you were hunting a civilian, but I'm not civilian anymore. I'm something much more dangerous. I'm a soldier who's been betrayed." Brian spat blood. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can." Brandon gestured to a wall monitor that flicked to life, showing surveillance footage of Brian planting weapons in Brandon's security consulting office. "My friend Javier installed cameras everywhere you've been. We have you on video tampering with evidence, stealing seized assets, and meeting with organized contacts." The footage was damning and complete. Brian's face appeared clearly in every frame as he planted illegal weapons in Brandon's files, weapons that could later be discovered during the raid. But wait, Brandon continued. There's more. The monitor switched to financial records showing money flowing from the Silver Creek police evidence accounts to offshore banks. Brian's name appeared on multiple transactions along with Ryan's and two other officers present in the room. You've all been stealing, Brandon said quietly. For years. Brian just convinced you that framing me was the next logical step. Chief Luis Ramirez's voice crackled through the radio on one officer's belt. All units, stand down. I repeat, stand down immediately. Brandon smiled. The cavalry arrives. Chief Ramirez, would you like to join us? I believe we have some things to discuss. Within minutes, the chief arrived with internal affairs investigators and FBI agents. Brandon's military contacts had worked faster than Brian could have imagined, turning his own corrupt network against him. Colonel Keene, Chief Ramirez said formally, I apologize. It appears we've been fed false information. No apology necessary, Chief. I understand you were working with compromised intelligence. As federal agents began arresting Brian and his co-conspirators, Brandon felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. But his revenge was far from complete. Melissa was still out there believing her husband would be in custody by evening. She had no idea that her world was about to collapse around her. Melissa Keene sat in the coffee shop of the Denver Hyatt Regency, nervously checking her phone every few minutes. Brian should have called by now with news of Brandon's arrest. Instead, there was only silence. At 10:45 a.m., her phone finally buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check the news. Your boyfriend won't be calling. With trembling fingers, Melissa opened her news app. The headline made her blood freeze. Local police officers arrested in corruption scandal. Special Forces veteran exposes multi-year conspiracy. The article detailed Brian's arrest along with 4 other officers on charges of evidence tampering, theft, and conspiracy. There was a photo of Brian in handcuffs being led away by FBI agents. Melissa's world began to crumble. If Brian was arrested, that meant Brandon knew everything. Her affair, the planned frame-up, her role in feeding information to Brian, everything was exposed. Her phone rang. Brandon's number. Hello, Melissa. His voice was calm, controlled, and more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. Bran, I can explain. No need. I have recordings of everything. Brian was very talkative at O'Malley's. He explained your entire scheme quite thoroughly. Melissa's mind raced, looking for an escape route. I was forced. Brian threatened me. Said he'd hurt you if I didn't cooperate. Interesting defense, Brandon replied. Except we have video of you planting surveillance equipment in my office, audio of you feeding Brian information about my clients, and multiple recordings of your motel visits where you were eager to betray your husband. The cafe around Melissa seemed to spin. Other patrons were looking at their phones, and she realized the story was spreading fast. Her name was being mentioned as a co-conspirator. What do you want? She whispered. I want you to come home, Melissa. We need to have a conversation. I can't. The police dash. The police are cleaning house. The FBI is handling Brian's case. But you and I have personal business to settle. Melissa's hands shook as she ended the call. She had 2 choices, run or face Brandon. Neither seemed likely to end well for her. While she sat paralyzed with fear, his next phase was already in motion. Noah Brandt, the master forger, had been busy preparing documents that would freeze Melissa's access to their joint accounts and credit cards. Legal papers filed that morning established Brandon as the sole owner of their home, business, and assets, all perfectly legal and based on evidence of Melissa's fraudulent activities. By the time Melissa tried to access money for a hotel room, she discovered that every account was frozen pending investigation. Her credit cards were canceled. Even her cell phone service was suspended for non-payment. With nowhere else to go, she drove back to Silver Creek, arriving at her house as the sun set. The media circus had moved on, leaving only a few police tape remnants and the quiet neighborhood where Shed lived for 7 years. Brandon was waiting in the living room, sitting calmly in his favorite chair. He'd changed out of his dress uniform into civilian clothes, but somehow looked more dangerous than when he'd been wearing his medals. Welcome home, he said quietly. Melissa stood in the doorway, afraid to enter her own house. Brand, please. We can work through this. Can we? Brandon's voice held no warmth. You've been cheating on me for months. You helped a corrupt cop plan to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. You photographed confidential client information that could have gotten people hurt. Explain to me what there is to work through. I made mistakes. You made choices, Brandon corrected. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment you spent in that motel room, those were choices. And choices have consequences. Melissa took a tentative step into the room. What kind of consequences? Brandon stood up, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, the kind that teach lessons about loyalty and betrayal, about what happens when someone targets the wrong man. You can't hurt me, Melissa said, though her voice lacked conviction. They'll call the police. With what phone, and which police did you plan to call? Brian is in federal custody. Ryan's been arrested. Chief Ramirez is cooperating with internal affairs to clean out the rest of the corruption. There's no one left to help you. Melissa, the reality of her situation finally hit home. She was completely alone, at the mercy of a man she'd betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. However, Brandon continued, I'm not going to hurt you. I don't need to. You've done a fine job of destroying yourself. Hannah Keene returned home from school to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at divorce papers. The events of the morning had spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, and Hannah had spent the day fielding questions and stares from classmates. Mom. Melissa looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Honey, I'm so sorry you had to hear about this at school. Is it true? Hannah asked quietly. Everything they're saying about you and that cop. The question hung in the air like a blade. Melissa had hoped to spin the story to somehow make herself the victim. But looking at her daughter's face so much like Brandon's when he was analyzing a situation, she realized lies wouldn't work. Yes, Melissa whispered. It's true. Hannah felt something break inside her chest. The mother she'd looked up to, the woman who taught her about honor and integrity, had been living a lie for months. Why? I was lonely. Your father was always working, always focused on his clients. Brian made me feel special. So you decided to help him frame Dad for crimes he didn't commit. Melissa flinched at the direct accusation. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Brian said it would just be a divorce, that would split the assets. I didn't know he was planning to make sure Dad didn't make it out of that raid. Hannah's voice rose. You didn't know that when you helped him plant evidence? When you gave him information about Dad's clients? Brandon appeared in the doorway, having listened to the entire conversation. His expression was unreadable as he watched his daughter confront her mother. Hannah, he said quietly, we need to talk. Father and daughter walked out to the back deck, leaving Melissa alone with her thoughts and the divorce papers that would strip her of everything. I'm sorry you had to see this, Brandon began. Are you really divorcing her? Hannah asked. Yes. Your mother made her choice when she decided to betray this family. There's no coming back from that. Hannah nodded, though tears ran down her face. What happens to me? That depends, Brandon said carefully. The divorce gives me full custody. But you're 16, old enough to make your own decisions about who you want to live with. You mean I could choose Mom? If that's what you want. Though she won't have much to offer. No house, no money, no job. Brian is going to prison, and she'll likely be charged as an accessory to his crimes. Hannah considered this. What about you? Will you be okay? Brandon smiled grimly. I'm a survivor, Han. I always have been. But I need to know that you understand what happened here. Your mother didn't just cheat on me. She tried to destroy everything I've built, everything I am. That's not a mistake or a moment of weakness. That's a calculated decision to betray family. I understand, Hannah said quietly. She chose him over us. That's right. And now she has to live with that choice. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the mountains. Then Hannah asked the question Brandon had been dreading. Dad, what are you going to do to her? Brandon considered his words carefully. I'm going to make sure she understands the full cost of betrayal. But I won't hurt her physically, if that's what you're asking. Good, Hannah said. Because as angry as I am, she's still my mother. I know, and I respect that. But Hannah, I need you to understand something else. From this point forward, this family consists of you and me. Your mother chose to leave it when she chose Brian. There's no going back. Hannah nodded, wiping away tears. I choose you, Dad. I choose us. Brandon felt relief wash over him. In a day full of victories and revenge, his daughter's loyalty meant more than all the rest combined. Inside the house, Melissa heard their voices through the window but couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She could see Hannah hugging Brandon, could see the way they stood together like allies. Her daughter had chosen her father's side. The realization hit Melissa like a physical blow. She hadn't just lost her husband and her home. She had lost her daughter, too. The divorce papers on the table suddenly seemed like a death certificate for the life she had known. Every signature would be another nail in the coffin of her old existence. But Brandon wasn't finished with her yet. The real punishment was still to come. 4 weeks after Brian's arrest, Melissa found herself living in a studio apartment on the wrong side of Silver Creek, working as a waitress at a highway diner. The woman who had once lived in a $425,000 home and driven a Lexus RX now counted tips to afford ramen noodles. Brandon's revenge had been comprehensive and methodical. Every joint asset had been frozen or transferred based on evidence of her criminal conspiracy. The house, the cars, the investment accounts all legally removed from her reach. Even her expensive jewelry had been seized as potential proceeds from Brian's illegal activities. But the financial destruction was only the beginning. Noah Brandt's forged documents had created a paper trail showing Melissa's deeper involvement in Brian's corruption. Bank records suggested she had been receiving payments for information about Brandon's security consulting clients. Suddenly, she wasn't just an adulteress. She was a suspected criminal who had endangered national security by compromising sensitive contracts. The FBI investigation expanded to include her activities. And while they couldn't prove she had received money, the suspicion was enough to destroy her reputation in Silver Creek. Her nursing license was suspended pending investigation. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Even grocery shopping became an exercise in public humiliation. Brandon had turned her into a pariah without lifting a finger in direct violence. On a cold Wednesday evening, Melissa's life took another devastating turn. She arrived at her apartment to find Luis Ramirez, the police chief, waiting by her door. "Mrs. Keene, we need to talk." "It's back to my maiden name," Melissa corrected. "Melissa Shore." "Miss Shore, what do you want?" "Brian is talking a lot, and your name keeps coming up." Melissa's blood went cold. "What kind of things?" "He's claiming you were the mastermind behind the plan to frame your ex-husband. Says you approached him with inside information and convinced him to build a case." "That's a lie." "Maybe, but he's got recordings. Conversations between you two discussing how to plant evidence and set up the raid. Seems Brian was paranoid about his partners. Recorded everything." Melissa sank against her apartment door. Brian had betrayed her just as thoroughly as she had betrayed Brandon. "What does this mean?" "It means you're looking at conspiracy charges, evidence tampering, and possibly accessory to attempted homicide. Brian has convinced the DA that you knew he planned to hurt Brandon during the raid and make it look like self-defense." "That's insane. I never did." "You or did you not tell Brian about Brandon's daily routines, his security protocols, the layout of his house?" Melissa's silence was answer enough. "Thought so. You're going to need a lawyer, Miss Shore. A good one." As the police chief walked away, Melissa's legs gave out. She slid down her apartment door to sit on the dirty hallway floor, finally understanding the full scope of Brandon's revenge. He hadn't just taken her money, and her home had maneuvered Brian into a position where the corrupt cop would sacrifice her to save himself. Every move had been calculated to make her enemies turn against each other while Brandon remained untouchable. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email." With trembling hands, Melissa opened her laptop and found a message from Brandon. No words, just a video attachment. The video showed Brian in his jail cell, speaking to his lawyer. The audio was crystal clear as Brian detailed how Melissa had been the real architect of the frame-up, how she had manipulated him into believing Brandon was dangerous, how she had provided all the intelligence needed to build their case. "She's the one who wanted him gone," Brian said on the recording. "Kept saying prison wasn't enough, that Brandon would find a way to come after us. She wanted me to make sure he didn't make it out of the raid." Melissa screamed at her laptop screen. "You lying bastard." But she knew it didn't matter what was true anymore. Brian's testimony, combined with the manufactured evidence Brandon had orchestrated, painted her as a calculating mastermind who had used a corrupt cop to destroy her husband. The next morning brought another devastating blow. Hannah arrived at Melissa's apartment, but not for a reconciliation. "I'm here to get my things," Hannah said coldly. "Hannah." Honey, please, let me explain. Explain what? How you tried to have Dad destroyed. How you planned to take everything and leave us with nothing. I never wanted him hurt. Brian is lying. Hannah studied her mother's face with Brandon's analytical gaze. It doesn't matter what you wanted, Mom. You started this. Everything that happened is because you chose to betray us. As Hannah packed her remaining belongings, Melissa made one last desperate plea. I'm still your mother. No, Hannah replied quietly. You stopped being my mother the day you chose Brian over your family. Dad warned me this might happen, that you'd try to use our relationship to manipulate me, but I won't let you. Hannah paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. For what it's worth, I hope you don't go to prison, but I also hope I never see you again. The door closed with a finality that echoed through Melissa's soul. She was now completely alone, facing criminal charges with no money, no family, and no allies. Brandon's revenge was almost complete. 7 months later, Brandon stood in the courthouse watching as the judge sentenced Brian Caldwell to 14 years in federal prison. The corrupt cop had pleaded guilty to conspiracy, evidence tampering, weapons trafficking, and attempted homicide in exchange for testifying against Melissa and his other co-conspirators. Melissa Shoreshed legally changed her name back after the divorce, received 4 years for her role in the conspiracy. Shed maintained her innocence until the end, but Brian's recordings and Brandon's carefully orchestrated evidence had painted a picture of calculated betrayal that no jury could ignore. As the bailiffs led Melissa away, she turned for one last look at Brandon. He met her gaze with cold indifference, feeling nothing but satisfaction at seeing justice served. Outside the courthouse, Hannah waited by Brandon's Ford F-150, now 17 and preparing for college. She had grown into a strong young woman who understood the difference between justice and revenge. How do you feel? She asked as they drove home. Complete, Brandon replied. Your mother and Brian thought they could destroy me and take everything I'd built. Instead, they destroyed themselves. Do you think she'll be okay in prison? Brandon considered the question. She'll survive. Prison might actually teach her some valuable lessons about loyalty and consequences. They drove in comfortable silence until Hannah asked, Dad, was all of this legal? What you did to them? Brandon smiled grimly. Completely legal. I used their own corruption against them, turned their allies into enemies, and let them hang themselves with their own rope. I never planted false evidence or committed any crimes. I just made sure the truth came out in the most devastating way possible. And you're okay with never forgiving them? Hannah, some betrayals are unforgivable. When someone tries to destroy your life, your family, your honor, there's no coming back from that. Forgiveness is for mistakes and misunderstandings. What they did was calculated evil. They arrived home to find a package waiting on the doorstep. Inside was a letter from Terrence Walsh at the Pentagon along with official documentation. What is it? Hannah asked. Brandon read the letter and smiled for the first time in months. The Pentagon is offering me a position as a special advisor on domestic security threats. Seems my handling of the Brian situation impressed some important people. Will you take it? Maybe. It would mean travel, but the pay is excellent. You could attend any college you want without worrying about money. Hannah hugged her father tightly. I'm proud of you, Dad. You could have done something terrible to them, but you chose justice instead. I chose victory, Brandon corrected. Brian is in prison. Your mother is paying for her crimes, and we've lost nothing except people who were never truly family to begin with. That evening, Brandon sat in his study, surrounded once again by his medals and commendations. But now they meant something different. They weren't just symbols of past service. They were reminders that honor and loyalty mattered, that betrayal had consequences, and that some men couldn't be broken by treachery. His phone buzzed with a text from Javier Ortiz. Heard about the Pentagon offer. Congratulations, Colonel. Justice served. Brandon's response was simple. Mission accomplished. As he prepared for bed, Brandon reflected on the past year. Melissa had tried to steal his life and failed. Brian had tried to frame him and failed. Both had underestimated who they were dealing with. Brandon Keene was many things: soldier, father, survivor. But above all, he was a man who understood that in a world full of betrayers and cowards, strength and loyalty were the only currencies that mattered. Head protected his daughter, preserved his honor, and ensured that justice was served. The corrupt had been punished, the guilty had paid their price, and the innocent had been protected. In Brandon's world, that was as close to a perfect ending as any soldier could hope for. The last thing he did before sleep was check the security system that now protected his home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he could rest knowing that betrayal had consequences. Honor still mattered, and some men were still worth the respect their uniform commanded. Brian Caldwell and Melissa Shore had learned the hard way what happened when someone targeted the wrong soldier. The lesson would serve as a warning to anyone else who thought they could break Brandon Keene. They had gambled everything on destroying him. Instead, they had destroyed themselves. Justice, Brandon reflected, was often the most elegant form of revenge. That's the end of the story. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.